eventually came together after that. But yeah, man, that game against Ole Miss, I wish I was there. I wish I could say I was, but that seemed like a really crazy atmosphere, and like we said, the birth of Sandstorm, essentially.
Yeah, just looking at the roster here, obviously Garcia, Alshon Jeffrey, Torrey Gurley, also at wide receiver, Gilmore, Swearinger, at defensive back, Melvin Ingram was there. I believe that was his true freshman season, if I remember correctly. So a lot of notable names on that team, and again, that was kind of the beginning of what became the best run of South Carolina football, in its program's history up to this point. We obviously hope for even more success in the Beamer era, and maybe this can potentially be one of those sparking off points as well. But Beamer talked to the media yesterday. You were there. A number of things that he got into, one of which, and asked multiple times about what happened this past weekend with Kentucky and Ole Miss. Cut number 7 here, Dave. He was asked if if Kentucky laid out the blueprint to beating Ole Miss on Saturday.
No, I think it's, I don't want to say so much a blueprint or worried so much about how Ole Miss is going to, come out. I'm sure Ole Miss will learn from, those games are from that Kentucky game. I'm sure they walk out of there thinking that they, left a lot of plays out there and want to do things better. So certainly you think about what are their answers going to be to maybe things that gave them trouble against Kentucky. And I know Lane talked about it in his press conference yesterday. Kentucky's defense is structured a lot differently than we are. So you can't really look at it and say, okay, it's going to be the same, because we're just different in a lot of ways. And Kentucky did a fabulous job, and Ole Miss certainly had their opportunities. So when I watch a game like that, watch it as a fan but also as a coach, and you certainly think about, some things that Kentucky did, but that's every week. I mean, when you're watching a team that you're going to take ideas from or steal things from, whatever you want to call it, that's every week. But I walked out of that game thinking, you know what, we knew Kentucky was a good team when we played them. They showed that against Georgia the next week, and then they showed that against Ole Miss Saturday. And then I also walked out of there saying, I knew Ole Miss is a really good team, and they showed that on Saturday, and it was just a heck of an SEC football game. That's kind of how I look at it. And then when you get back in here on Sunday, then you really dive into the tape and, maybe things that you thought were happening on the TV copy, you really dive into it when you see the sideline and the end zone views and kind of see different things on both sides as well.
Do you believe in the transitive property of football at all, or any sport for that matter? We're saying if Team A beat Team B and Team B beats Team C, that means Team A should beat Team C?
No, I don't, because here's the thing with college football especially. Every week, something different can happen. It's not like, Kentucky beat Ole Miss, so South Carolina is guaranteed to beat Ole Miss because of that, and South Carolina beat Kentucky pretty easily. You never know. I mean, anything is possible this week, but it is. I mean, look, I think you learned a lot about Ole Miss in that game. They have some weaknesses. However, you don't think Ole Miss is going to adjust and stuff? I mean, they're going to look probably like a different team on Saturday, and whether South Carolina steps up to the challenge or not remains to be seen, but I have a feeling they can.
A couple of things that Kentucky did do this past week and that I think are going to be big keys to South Carolina if they want to pick up the victory on Saturday. They kept the ball away from Ole Miss. The time of possession in that game was roughly about 40 minutes Kentucky, 20 minutes Ole Miss. Now Ole Miss does play at a fast tempo, so they don't take a lot of time on their drives typically, but still, Kentucky held on to the ball. They went on longer drives themselves and just kept possession of the ball for most of the game, which, again, I think is going to be a big key for South Carolina if they want to win this weekend.
Definitely. And a lot of those drives for Ole Miss weren't super long, like we said. I mean, Kentucky's were, obviously play-by-play, very, very slow tempo. That's why it ended up being 40 minutes. Ole Miss, like you said, very quick, very fast. But a lot of those drives, I think only one drive they had went more than 10 plays. So it's getting off the field quicker is the key for South Carolina in this game, and I wonder how they're going to be able to handle that tempo. I think Old Dominion was a good test early in the year, running a little bit tempo. I could be wrong. I think Kentucky tried to run a little bit quicker, but for the most part, I think South Carolina can handle it. It's just, okay, how are you going to stop all the playmakers this team has?
And South Carolina's done such a good job this year when it comes to rotating, and that's something that we were excited about coming into the season. Hey, they're going to have the ability to rotate guys in at defensive line and at linebacker and just keep fresh bodies in there. Well, if Ole Miss has a drive going their way, they're not going to let you substitute, much like Tennessee, where it's just play after play after play. And, you're going to have guys with hands on their hips and hands on their heads trying to catch their breath, and meanwhile they're lining up for their next play 15 seconds later.
Yeah, that's something that is going to be something you got to really. I mean, you could prepare for it all you want in practice and stuff, but when it comes game time, it's going to be different. And so I do wonder how they're going to handle it. I think Clayton White has done a really good job, and this entire defensive staff, of getting new guys in there and, knowing when it's time for, hey, this guy's worn out, let's get someone else in there. But, if you're, it's 5-6 plays in, you're already, on the other side of the field, and you need to make a stop on third down. I mean, you got to keep the guy in, and you also want to avoid having 12 men on the field. So there's a lot that goes into it, but I think South Carolina is prepared for, whatever is to come on Saturday.
Something else Kentucky did really well this past weekend was limiting Ole Miss on third down. Of course, we talked about it this week, only going 1 of 10 on third down conversions. Their average down and distance also 6.9 yards. So they consistently kept them in third down and long, kept them from having the ability to run the ball a lot in those situations. Obviously, Trey Harris had a monster game, but the consistency was not there between him and Jackson Dart when it needed to be on third downs.
That's what you have to do to win this game on Saturday. And for South Carolina in general on offense too, they need to win the third down battle because they haven't been very good on third downs either. So I think with this Ole Miss team, look, I think they're going to come out with a lot of different things. I think there's going to be a lot of play calls we haven't seen from them yet. They're going to be able to run the ball. They're going to be able to throw the ball, I think, to Trey Harris and Juice Wells this time around. How does South Carolina defend all that, I think, is the question.
And then another thing that they did, which is going to be very important, and we think South Carolina is very capable, is keeping pressure on Jackson Dart the entire game, something that he hadn't really faced up to that point this season because they were playing not very good defensive teams overall, but especially when it came to pass rush. But Kentucky and Brad White, we know, likes to bring the blitz a lot. They consistently kept Jackson Dart under pressure, sacked him 4 times in that game, and kept him off balance enough. Now, he was still fairly consistent when it came to throwing under pressure, went 12-21 with 1 touchdown and 1 interception, so far this season. But again, putting pressure on him is going to be a big key to them winning this game.
I think it's a huge key in order to win this game. I mean, look, you saw what happened when Dart faced pressure, especially late in that game. He had to make some errant throws. I mean, I think he took a sack at one point. Like, it was just, there is a blueprint out there to an extent. It's not a carbon copy of, hey, do all this and you can win the game, because South Carolina and Kentucky are different in some ways. But I do think if there is one thing you can copy, it is bringing pressure. And if you force him to either take sacks or make some, harder throws in the pocket, who knows what can happen in the secondary. I feel good about South Carolina's secondary going up against these receivers. It's just about those guys making plays out there.
Something else to watch out for, Ole Miss is 125th nationally when it comes to penalty yards per game. They are heavily penalized on defense as well, especially in their secondary. This past weekend against Kentucky, 5 defensive penalties, 2 pass interference, and 1 holding call. And that's something that's been very consistent over the course of the first 5 games they've played. A lot of penalties on the guys in their secondary. Very physical. They're going to be mugging receivers. And there's a thing when you become known as a team that's aggressive with your DBs, you're going to get called for those things more. And that's something that South Carolina is going to need to exploit this weekend. Get those free yards, get those free first downs, keep them consistently pulling flags on those DBs for Ole Miss.
They have to, because, look, if they're not able to make plays out there in space because of Ole Miss is really, playing tight and guarding them, I don't know. But I do think look, they've had 2 weeks to kind of see, okay, this is what Ole Miss looks like. Try to exploit whatever you can, the penalties, the defense, just anything in general. And, I mean, it will only help your chances this weekend.
Definitely so. We'll continue to dive into what Coach Beam had to say yesterday, flip things around, and see what South Carolina's secondary is up against with this passing attack that Ole Miss is bringing to the table to see if South Carolina can pull off another big win this year. It is the Extra Point, Tyler Head and Jack Beltry, along with you on your Wednesday here on The Game. Welcome back into the Extra Point. Tyler Head and Jack Veltri along with you here on your Wednesday, talking all things South Carolina and Ole Miss. By the way, you'll get your last chance to hear from Coach Beamer ahead of Saturday's game coming up tomorrow with Carolina Calls at 6 p.m. Him and Todd Ellis here on the game in Columbia and in Myrtle Beach. Jack, you're a regular attendee of Carolina Calls. Is that fun? I've never been out to one of those. Is it neat?
I've been, I think, 3 times so far this season, and it's purely just to just be there and hear what he says and stuff. But it's fine. If you want to go, I would recommend it at least one time.
Yeah, well, if you can't go, you can always listen to it here on the game.
Exactly. That's the beauty of it.
So, again, plenty of things to talk about ahead of Saturday's game against Ole Miss. And one of the key matchups in this game is South Carolina containing Trey Harris and limiting what Ole Miss is going to try and do through the air. Coach Beamer talked about that a little bit yesterday in his presser as well. Go cut number 10 here, Dave. This is him talking about what the secondary is going to have to do on Saturday.
Yeah, no, they'll have to play well. We'll have to do a great job tackling, and that's a key for us this week, is we've really got to tackle well. That's one thing I thought Kentucky did a great job of last week is making one-on-one tackles, and Ole Miss is going to get their yards. You know, they're going to get their carries and catches. We just got to do a great job tackling, not just in the secondary, but all 11 guys on defense, to make sure that those 5-yard gains don't turn into 30-yard gains, and for sure. But certainly the secondary, without a doubt, because they get to going fast, and then there's a miscommunication or somebody doesn't play the right technique and you're giving up touchdown passes over your head, and that's what can't happen. And it's not just the secondary, it's the linebackers and everyone that have to do a great job from a coverage standpoint, but starting with tackling all 3 levels of the defense.
Trey Harris is averaging over 150 yards per game, had 176 and a touchdown last weekend against Kentucky. And this is very much one of those situations he's going to get his, right? And the fact that he went for almost 200 yards and they still lost the game tells you that even if he has a monster day, that doesn't mean it's going to necessarily go against you. You just have to make sure the guys around him aren't having monster days either.
Exactly. Like he's been, even before that game, like he's been a guy that this is the guy for them at receiver. I know they have Juice Wells and stuff, but obviously Juice is not Trey Harris. So he's a tough guy to stop, but I think I don't even know if South Carolina is going to stop him. I don't know if anyone's really going to stop him at this point. But if South Carolina can find a way to just slow him down a little bit, maybe cut those receptions in half or even the yardage, that's a win right there. And then figure out a way to hold the rest of these guys in check, like Juice and stuff especially. I think they definitely can. It is going to be, I think, probably the most critical battle of the day, in my opinion.
I was listening to the Locked On podcast for Ole Miss yesterday, and their host, Stephen Willis, was kind of hammering home an interesting point that I hadn't really thought about, but he believes that they're too reliant on Trey Harris. He is accounting for 40% of their receptions right now on offense. And again, when you have a guy that's that hot-handed, you're going to try and get the ball as much as you can. But if South Carolina is able to, like you said, cut that production in half, is there enough faith in Caden Lee, in Juice Wells, and some of these other guys on the offense to be able to pick up the slack and perform at a high level to make up for whatever he's not able to do?
It's definitely possible. Look, here's the thing with Juice Wells. It would not shock me if he had some record-breaking day or anything. This is just the year of former Gamecocks terrorizing their former team and stuff. We saw with Jermaine Cousinard and Michael Braswell. I mean, football's the only sport left that we haven't seen anything happen like that yet. So, I mean, it wouldn't shock me. At the same time, it's like, I think Ole Miss, I mean, there's a reason why Trey Harris has significantly more catches and targets than anyone else. He's got 49 catches on the year, 804 yards. The next highest receiver, Caden Lee, 16 catches, 275 yards, and Juice Wells is right behind him. So I think it is possible that these other guys get going, but it's not going to be like you can't expect it to happen like you can with a Trey Harris, if that makes sense.
I think that's the fear a lot of people have going into this game, that this is going to be Juice Wells, coming out party at Ole Miss, and his numbers have been fine so far this year for the limited amount of receptions that he's made. He had 2 targets this past weekend against Kentucky, didn't haul in either one of those catches, so his stat line doesn't really show up for that one. But again, he hasn't really had that breakout game. And like you mentioned with Couisnard, with Braswell, like it just seems like a trend. And you can go back years and years, in the past for things like this happening as well, where former Gamecocks just have a way of showing out against their team.
It's the unfortunate destiny of being a former Gamecock and getting the first crack at playing against South Carolina. It's just been a weird year in that regard, but at the same time, it's like, I don't know. I mean, he's either going to go off or it's going to be South Carolina is going to hold him in check, just like Kentucky did. There's no in between.
Ole Miss offense, to me, is very reminiscent of what you saw against LSU a couple weeks ago. A very capable quarterback, a lot of good wide receivers, a good offensive line, a running game that's coming along. Not a world-beating running game, but one that can certainly make you pay. And when looking at the coverage matchups South Carolina had, like Kyron Lacey was obviously their leading guy, and he had a solid day, had 5 receptions for 63 yards and a touchdown. Didn't destroy South Carolina, but Mason Taylor, Aaron Anderson, C.J. Daniels, these other guys ended up putting together very solid performances themselves, where at the end of the day, you look at them and say, okay, well, LSU really hurt South Carolina through the air over the course of that game, especially in the second half. And again, that's something you have to try and prevent this weekend against the core of receivers that they're bringing to the table in Ole Miss.
Now, I wonder how they're going to do handling both the run and pass. I think in pass coverage, there's going to be plays that Ole Miss makes. I mean, I think that's just the way it's going to go. It just comes down to, okay, is South Carolina going to be able to make more plays in the secondary? And then, look, going back to that LSU game, they have to be able to stop the run. I think take away the run, and it makes things so much easier. I think if they did take away some of the big explosive runs LSU had, maybe this is a different ball game for the multiple reasons. But I do think Saturday, it's not Quinshon Judkins in the backfield anymore. It's Henry Parrish and the Matt Jones, guys like that, and Jackson Dart. So eliminate the run game the best you can, and then rely on your secondary to contain these big weapons they have out there in space.
Also, I'm going to be interested to see, because Henry Parrish was banged up at the end of that game against Kentucky. I believe the first injury report is going to come out today.
It is today.
And I'm interested to see what they list about Henry Parrish, because he may not be either a full go or a go at all this weekend if he's dealing with a concussion or something.
And even if he's banged up going to this game, that's better than him being 100%. And I think that spells well for South Carolina, especially in this run defense that needs to be better this weekend. And I definitely think with some time off, look, they've had, like I said before, they've had plenty of time to take a look at this Ole Miss team and stuff and see what they're about. Now it's just about their going out there on the field and just doing it.
Beamer alluded to it in that clip we played a couple of minutes ago. Tackling is going to be very important once again. We talked ad nauseum about the 17 missed tackles against LSU a couple weeks ago. You cannot do that against a team that athletic and that skilled. And if you have similar numbers like that this weekend, I would say you're probably not going to win this game.
I would say so. I mean, look, the missed tackles were such an issue 2 weeks ago. I mean, against Akron, it was a lot better. But then again, it's Akron. These are going to be more speedy, quick, twisty type of players that can make plays happen on their own. So South Carolina needs to be able to tackle them. Like I've said plenty of times before, one guy needs to be right behind. Multiple guys need to be right behind the first tackler and wrap up if they miss the tackles. It's a key in this game.
Jason hits us on the Firehouse Subs text line 803-404-6100. I feel like Lane Kiffin is the type of guy who would definitely try and work juice into the game plan, and even more than normal because of the circumstances and the fact that he's fully capable. I totally agree with you. That is such a Lane Kiffin type of thing. Remember back over the summer we had the video of him catching a pass in practice with 2001 as the music just to poke the bear a little bit more with South Carolina fans. Lane Kiffin would definitely do something like that if he thinks Juice Wells is capable of picking up that slack. And I wouldn't be surprised if the first pass goes Juice Wells' way, like in the offensive script. Like, I don't care what coverage they give you, just throw it to Juice Wells in the first play.
I would totally agree with this, honestly. But at the same time, it is like Ole Miss is coming off a loss. And look, this is a team that we've talked about all year. They should be in the college football playoff. They have the talent to be there. And I don't know. I mean, Lane, listening to Lane Kiffin's talk in his press conference earlier this week, it sounded just like all serious, all business and stuff, like no joking around. I hope that's if I'm an Ole Miss fan, that's the approach I'd like the head coach to take. But at the same time, like, it would not surprise me if he tries to troll South Carolina here with some Juice Wells magic.
Let's talk about Lane Kiffin a little bit more coming up next, because he is such an interesting enigma in college football. But where does he kind of fall in terms of like, elite level coaches or great coaches in college football? Because I don't think it matches up with how highly people think of him. We'll hit that coming up next. It is the Extra Point. Tyler Head and Jack Veltri on your Wednesday here on The Game.
Yeah, I think they were really disappointed. I think they were really upset, really hurt. And I told them today that's a good thing, you know, for guys that in the room that didn't and just went on with their day and, you know, it didn't really hurt. That'll show you. The more you're invested, the more you put in something, you're going to feel different afterwards than somebody that isn't invested and doesn't put all their heart into it. So I think it was a good thing that they struggled so much the last 2 days.
Welcome back in as the Extra Point. Tyler Head and Jack Beltray along with you here on your Wednesday on the Game. It is our Laying the Wood segment brought to you by our friends over at Georgia Pacific. And Kentucky certainly laid the wood to the hopes and dreams of Ole Miss, at least for last weekend, by picking up that win on the road in Oxford. And that was Coach Kiffin's reaction to that and how the team was reacting to it. Obviously very frustrated, very upset, considering the high expectations that were placed on Ole Miss coming into the season with as talented of a roster as they had. We fully expected them to be undefeated coming in to this weekend's matchup against South Carolina, and obviously that is not the case. And it begs a bigger question to me, I think, about what exactly Lane Kiffin is as a coach, because he's one of the few personalities left in college football. And I was listening to his press conference the other day like everybody else, like, oh, what's he going to say? Is there going to be a zinger in there about Ole Miss? He's going to take a shot at Beamer about something. And given the fact they were coming off a loss, he, like you said, was more reserved, more businesslike, nothing, you know, out of the ordinary that he said. But we know these things happen. He took the shot at, you know, who the other day talking about his relationships with quarterbacks. Hugh Freeze. He's taking shots at Brian Kelly. Like, there's always zingers in there. His personality on Twitter, the thing with his dog. Like, he's this enigma of a head coach, but is he really that great overall? Because I think we think of him at this high level, but he's not accomplished nearly as much as clearly the Kirby Smarts, the Dabo Swinney, certainly not the Nick Sabans. He's a good coach, but he's not like this elite level great coach. And I think that can kind of get misconstrued sometimes when talking about him.
What's his dog's name? Juice?
Juice. The dog was named Juice before Juice got there. Sure. That's just a coincidence. But he used that as leverage in the social media stuff when talking about Juice coming to the SIP, as he calls it.
You know, when I think of Lane Kiffin, I think of him as a good coach. Not a great one, and I'll get into that in a second. He is unlike any coach in college football, in my opinion. Just very quirky, very different, more of a troll than anything. And he, you know, just no filter, to be honest, in my opinion. That said, he has gotten Ole Miss to a good point where, you know, you expect them to be in the hunt every year. But I don't expect to see Lane Kiffin, you know, contending for a national championship, if that makes sense. He's not like the Nick Sabans, those types of coaches in the world, the Kirby Smarts that are winning national championships and stuff, or being right in that hunt. It's, you know, 10 wins, make a bowl game, and that's good enough. And look, I think you expect him this year and this team to get to the playoff. And if you can't make the playoff this year, how does that change your perspective of how you feel about Lane Kiffin?
Lane Kiffin is a coach who you respect for his abilities on offense because he's a really great offensive mind.
Yeah, it's always been the case.
I don't think you look at Lane Kiffin's teams as, man, it's terrifying when they come to town. Again, they're very talented. One of the more talented rosters in all of college football, and many people went ahead and put them in the college football playoff. I thought they were going to be a playoff team before the season as well, but it's almost like the loss against Kentucky, you know, kind of washed our eyes a little bit for what this Ole Miss team might actually be. And I think it's interesting to look back on Lane Kiffin's history as a head coach, specifically in college football. He's never put together back-to-back great seasons. You know, was at only 1 year at Tennessee. Can't really take anything from that. But at Southern Cal, 8-5, 10-2. Then he went 7-6 and got fired on the tarmac the year after that. Florida Atlantic went 11-3, then 5-7, then had a 10-3 year before he wanted to be Ole Miss's head coach. And since he's been at Ole Miss, 5-5, 10-3, 8-5, 11-2. So the trends tell you this is supposed to be a regression year, where they might be around 8, maybe 9 wins, but certainly not to that level of where people expect them to be coming into the season. Again, a good coach, but not a coach that is consistent enough to strike fear in opponents' hearts by saying, oh, hey, Kiffin's coming to town this weekend, watch out.
No, definitely. And look, they Ole Miss won the transfer portal and recruiting. I mean, look, they brought in all the guys they needed to. Like Shane Beamer said yesterday, they definitely beefed up their trenches with the offensive line and defensive line to compete in the SEC, because that's what they were really missing. They have all the weapons out there, but they need those guys up front to really be able to make some plays, whether it's blocking or making tackles. But I think with Lane Kiffin, you're right. Every other year, it's kind of, regression and then step up, regression, step up. If they lose to South Carolina this weekend, they go to LSU on the 12th, and then they get Oklahoma, and they still have to play Georgia. This schedule is tough after that, so I can definitely see 4, maybe 5 losses if they squeak another one in there. It would be very, I guess, I don't even want to call it disappointing, but just very underwhelming if this Ole Miss team doesn't get to the playoff.
Well, and I think this is the highest expectations that fan base has put on this team maybe ever. I mean, you could certainly say in the Hugh Freeze years, they had high expectations, even though that was still when Alabama was at the height of its dominance. Though. It wasn't like this, though. Again, you come off of the best year in program history, winning, was it the Peach Bowl last year that they won? Yeah, the Peach Bowl. With 11 wins, you have this great offseason where you acquire all this talent. Literally, go through their roster. Everybody's a transfer, with the exception of like 3 or 4 guys in their starting lineup. It's mainly transfers. And that's what they built this program through up to this point. And you lose to Kentucky, a game that nobody thought you were going to lose. You still got the tough games down the road against Georgia and teams like that, where if you lose this game against South Carolina this Saturday, everybody's saying, well, okay, well, yeah, we're probably going to go 8-4 now.
Yeah, like honestly, that is a real reality. Like, I don't see them beating LSU, especially it's a night game. So yeah, I mean, that's the toughest place to play when you're talking about night games and stuff, other than probably like Jordan-Hare. But the point is, look, this Ole Miss team is built to go to the playoffs, and on paper they have a great team. But at the same time, I think what we need to think about here, and we kind of see it with teams like Colorado and stuff that really build their team around the portal, chemistry. It's such an underrated part of football. Like, you have to be able to work together as a team to win. And I know that sounds cliche, but it's true. You have to have that camaraderie. And I mean, you bring a bunch of random guys together, it's not always going to work. And when you lose, especially, times become tougher. So if Ole Miss can weather the storm and get through this weekend and find a way to win, I think they'll be fine. But if they lose this game, it's like, okay, trouble's ahead. And I don't know if they're going to be able to recover after this weekend.
David weighs in on the Firehouse Subs text line and says his last name helps him as it does for Coach Beamer. Of course, Monty Kiffin, legendary head coach who passed away over the summer, obviously. It certainly helped Lane Kiffin get his foot in the door when it came to coaching and, getting the opportunities like with the Raiders back in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, excuse me, and all that stuff. And that's not to say that Lane Kiffin has not earned the position that he is currently in. But I think there is a part of it when you do have the son of a, famous and legendary coach that you almost kind of loop in the dad's success with what the son is doing. And obviously they're very different. Now you have guys like Kyle Shanahan that has proven that, he's no longer Mike Shanahan's son. He is Kyle Shanahan, stands on his own, has taken multiple teams to the Super Bowl, has not just gotten over the hump of winning that game just yet. And that's what you're always fighting as the son, and not just in coaching, but in any sport, to get out of your dad's shadow. And I don't know if Kiffin has fully escaped Monty Kiffin's shadow just yet. He's done a lot, and he's accomplished quite a bit as a head coach, but he's not performed consistently to the high level that I think a lot of people have expected him to.
I think to some extent, I kind of disagree, because I feel like I think he kind of is, because when I hear Lane Kiffin's name brought up in comparison to Shane Beamer, I hear Frank Beamer's name brought up all the time, comparing him to Shane Beamer, the son of legendary head coach Frank Beamer. It's not to say I don't hear the same with Monty Kiffin, but it's like not as common. I usually just hear about Lane Kiffin. But
I think a lot of that has to do with the off the field stuff.
Oh, totally.
It's not all on the field.
Yeah.
Like Kyle Shanahan has eclipsed his dad's shadow because of what he's done on the field.
Yes.
And he has a little bit of a personality off the field, but I think Lane Kiffin, the quirkiness, the one-liners, the shots he takes at, Nick Saban from years past and all these other coaches, I think that is what people focus on a little bit more. And again, great offensive mind, but I still think from the purely football standpoint, a lot of people still look at him as Monty Kiffin's son.
All right. So that I can agree with, but at the same time, it's like Lane's been around the block. He was did a great job as the OC at Alabama. I know they kind of left on weird terms there, but he was there for a while. He's been he was solid at Florida Atlantic. He's been pretty good at Ole Miss, but again, he's just missing that great. He's like. Think of it like S tier for all the great coaches in college football. I'd say Lane Kiffin's somewhere in that A to B range, and he just needs to, this is the year. Get the playoff. You're in that range, I think.
He's on the verge of breaking through. And if he could take this very talented Ole Miss team to the 12-team playoff, even if they got bounced in the first round, that would be a notable accomplishment for, again, a program that has always been relatively good, but never great or elite when it comes to college football.
That's what they're missing.
And this is their opportunity to take that step. And this game this weekend is so huge because they lose back-to-back. Well, they have no margin for error at all going forward.
It's a bad look. It's a very bad look. And again, LSU, Georgia, we probably expect those teams to win those games against Ole Miss. There's a real possibility of 4 losses by the end of the year. And, I don't even know if firing is a real possibility yet, but...
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
But like the expectations for Lane Kiffin moving forward decrease.
It's going to be a huge disappointment if this team is playing in the Citrus Bowl instead of playing in the college football playoff.
Yeah,
yes,
it would
essentially.
It'd be the biggest disappointment of the year because this is the team for sure we thought would be a lock.
A lot of pressure on Ole Miss this upcoming weekend. A lot of pressure on Major League Baseball teams right now as the postseason got underway yesterday. We'll hit some of that and recap what happened for day number 1. Coming up next to wrap up hour number 1 of the Extra Point. Tyler Head and Jack Feltry along with you here on The Game.
He swings, sends one high and deep to left. He's watching, so are 44,000 others. Oh, what a start for the Padres as Tatis leaves the building, and this place is on its feet. Padres lead it 2-0.
Welcome back in. It is the Extra Point. Tyler Head and Jack Belcher along with you here on The Game. That was the call last night on ESPN as Fernando Tatis launches a 2-run homer early as the Padres pick up the 4-0 victory over the Braves in Game 1 of the National League Wild Card Series. And a game that, as a Braves fan, I was not expecting much out of the team. They played 5 games in 4 days. They had played a doubleheader on Monday against the Mets. They flew into San Diego at midnight on Monday night and had to turn around and play a game less than 24 hours later with their keys pitcher Chris Sale already hurt. I did not expect much out of this game, and it gave me about what I expected.
Yeah, look, it's a tough situation for the Braves to be in right now because Chris Sale's down, and your team literally had to fly across country to play a very good Padres team. And look, as soon as Fernando Tatis Jr. hit that home run in the bottom of the first inning, I think
kind of over.
I think a lot of people sense this game's kind of a wrap. And yeah, they got shut out, but I mean, look, at the same time, and I know it's different because the Mets only had to go to Milwaukee, but I mean, the Mets, they played good and won a big game. So I feel like the Braves are in a better position tonight because they got Max Fried going.
Mm-hmm.
They're going against Joe Musgrove. We'll see what happens, but this Braves offense, they gotta score runs in order to win.
Yeah, and that was the thing to me. And look, outside of Smith-Shawver, getting dinged around in the inning third that he pitched, the rest of the bullpen actually pitched really well.
Yeah,
Bummer,
solid.
Chavez, Jackson gave up the home run late in the game, but all things considered, they did a relatively good job against a very good offense in San Diego. But the Braves offense just wasn't there. Tired, whatever the excuse is, they just looked lethargic last night. Michael Harris Jr. got on base a couple times, but they just couldn't string runs together and build up enough support on the base path to generate anything.
And we were talking about before the show. I mean, Michael King, former Yankee, he was the key part in that trade in the return for the Juan Soto trade. Dealing last night, 12 strikeouts. I mean, no walks at all for the Braves, which is massive in this game when you only have 7 hits. But, I mean, Michael King was dealing last night, 12 strikeouts. The Padres have a pretty solid rotation, but I think that's about as good as it's going to get. I do think the Braves, despite what many probably think it's over, I do think with Max Fried on the mound tonight, you put some runs together. I mean, you could probably win this game 2-1, 3-2 if you need to.
Yeah, this was the game that I think a lot of people are pointing to for the Braves to maybe do something. I don't want to say you completely punt on the first game of the series, but the Braves had the odds stacked against them. And Fried, again, has been banged up this year too, like everybody else in the Braves seems to be. But if he goes out there and can pitch to his best, the Braves do have a chance. And it might be a low-scoring game, like you said, 2-1 or something like that. But, you have an opportunity. And, again, your back's up against the wall. If you don't win this one, it's over. And you're heading home after this. And regardless of what happens, I didn't have the expectations for the Braves to get out of San Diego in the series because making the postseason, dealing with what they did this entire year was an accomplishment in and of itself. But, again, you have a chance when you're in the postseason, anything can happen.
Yep. Literally just about anything can happen. And look, the Braves, it's not over yet, so they still have somewhat of a chance.
Around the rest of baseball, you mentioned the Mets picking up the 8-4 win in game number 1 up there in Milwaukee. The Tigers pick up 3-1 win over the Astros, and the Royals end up taking down the Orioles 1-0. Terry and I were joking about this earlier. When Bobby Witt Jr. comes up to bat and you have a runner on third and first base is open with, I believe, 2 outs, wouldn't you just give him a free pass? Wouldn't you just let him on base instead of allowing him to knock in the 1 run that ends up losing you the game?
It's just like with Aaron Judge with the Yankees or anyone along those lines. If you're facing the team's best hitter and the base is open, walk him. I've always been a proponent of that, and take your chances with the rest of that lineup. Because, look, Bobby Witt Jr. is probably going to finish runner-up for AL MVP this year. He is so good and so fun to watch, but take the bat out of his hands there. Just put him on first base, but Orioles pay the price.
All the wild card series will continue once again today. All those taking place at the same time. Detroit and the Astros at 2:30 on ABC. Royals and Orioles at 4:30 on ESPN. Mets and Brewers at 7:30 on ESPN. And then again, Braves and Padres wrap things up at 8:30 on ESPN2. And of course, if all the teams that won yesterday win today, no games tomorrow. And we'll go ahead and move on to the NLDS and ALDS coming up this weekend, where your Yankees are waiting.
Yep, they are. I've thought about it. The one team I do not want to see this team face wouldn't be until the ALCS. The Detroit Tigers are scary, man. Tariq Skubal, dangerous. The rest of that team, we'll see. But, for the Yankees and the ALDS, Baltimore, KC, it's going to be tough. But we'll have to see what happens. I'm hoping this goes 20 innings today and then, 20 more innings tomorrow. Burn as many pitchers as you can.
October is the best sports month of the entire year, and postseason baseball is one of the big reasons why, as well as a great slate of college football coming up this weekend with South Carolina and Ole Miss. We'll dive into that a little bit more coming up in hour number 2 of as well of the Extra Point. Tyler Head, Jack Belcher, along with you on your Wednesday here on The Game. Welcome back in. It is the Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you on your Wednesday on the game, as we do each and every Wednesday. We check in our guy, Dimitri Ravanos, and talk a little bit about what's happening around the SEC and college football. And Dimitri, I should congratulate you for your alma mater's victory on Saturday, now being the new #1 team in college football, and the people in Tuscaloosa not having to get their pitchforks and torches out to go find Kalen DeBoer after the game.
Yeah, I talked to a couple of people that were there, and they said, you have no idea how necessary that was, because it was miserable getting into that game between the Secret Service for President Trump being there, and just, I don't know if people appreciated this in Columbia before last week or 2 weeks ago, the chaos ESPN causes there. I know media people that got to the stadium by 2:00 because they had no choice. So yeah. I think the fan base very much needed the collective joy and sigh of relief after that game.
Well, and DeBoer through his first, 3-4 games of the year playing non-conference opponent, had done everything right outside of, shooting themselves in the foot for 3.5 quarters against South Florida. But they won those games the way they were supposed to win, and there was no reason to be concerned. But if Georgia came in there and, beat them by a couple scores, people say, wait a minute, this isn't the Alabama that we've known and loved. And they nearly blew it by blowing that 28-point lead, but they held on for the win. And now there's a lot of belief like, hey, this is still the same quality of Alabama team that we've seen under Nick Saban, and, can compete for a national championship this year as well.
I think if there's anything that gave the fan base pause, it was that in this game, they looked a lot like Washington did last year. And listen, Washington ended up somewhere Alabama didn't, which was played for a national championship. So take that with a grain of salt. But Washington last year, their defense especially, had this quality that Spencer Hall described as like the band from the Muppet Show that like doesn't realize they have something to do until 5 minutes before they're supposed to be doing it. Where like, at the last second, they made the interception that sealed the game. But before that, they looked really out of sorts in the second half. I'm with you, though. Like, I think what DeBoer can accomplish in a much more well-stocked recruiting area with a school that will spend anything that is necessary on football. Like, the sky might be the limit for that dude.
Absolutely. And that completed the first month of college football. And now that we have 4 to 5 game sample size for most teams, I think we can, say a few absolutes on what we've learned from the first month in the SEC. And perhaps my biggest takeaway, one of my biggest takeaways this month, is I don't think the Hugh Freeze experiment at Auburn is going to work. That is one of those things where they might have a new coach by 2026.
I would agree with you. I don't think he gets a year 3.
You don't think
I really
year
don't.
3? Okay.
No, I think that if you look at not just the online reaction to Hugh Freeze, but the fact that they keep losing in the same way, I think patience has worn very thin for the guy, the way he has treated his players in terms of, gosh, it's never the play calling that's the problem. I think he has lost a lot of support. Now, when I say I don't think that the Hugh Freeze-Auburn marriage gets a year 3, that could be on Auburn's end, that could be on Hugh Freeze's end. There has been a lot of discussion about would Florida be interested in Hugh Freeze? And I think if Florida were interested, I think Hugh would be interested. But yeah, this is clearly, and like, I'm a little biased here because I've been sort of pounding the table on this from the beginning. I never understood it. I never thought it would go any way other than this. So I am not surprised in the least that we're here with Hugh Freeze.
Well, and it all centers around what's happening at quarterback, because in the offseason, he did not opt to go out and find another quarterback in the transfer portal, opting to instead say, hey, I can fix Peyton Thorne. That is clearly not happening.
But it's also, Tyler, what's going on in the play calling, because whereas the rest of the sport has evolved since Hugh Freeze and Ole Miss beat Alabama in 2014 and 2015, Hugh Freeze has not. And when everybody is running RPOs, that playbook is not special. And if you don't have special players, or to your point, if all of your special players are dependent on someone who really does not have it together, and that's true whether it's Peyton Thorne or Hank Brown this season, you're SOL. Like, I can't think of a better term for it.
What is something you've learned through the first month of the SEC?
I think that it is pretty clear that if we think Alabama's at the top of the conference right now, their biggest threat is Tennessee. I think Tennessee is every bit the offense we thought they were going to be, and I don't think the offense is their best unit.
Yeah, no, their defense is certainly very, very strong. And we saw a couple years ago with the 2022 team with Hendon Hooker that could go out there and score 70 points. As we saw against South Carolina, they couldn't stop a nosebleed in some games. That ended up being their biggest downfall. But the fact that they are very complete on both sides of the football, and look, they still got to play Alabama, still got to play Georgia. I don't know if they get through both those games undefeated, but they could at least split those games to where we're talking about them being 11-1, playing in Atlanta, maybe even hosting the first round or the playoffs or getting the bye too.
Yeah, I think when you look at their talent, the most talented guy on that team is James Pierce Jr., the defensive end. And yeah, he hasn't really gotten going, but they haven't needed him to yet. I still think that's the most talented dude on the defensive side of the ball in the SEC.
Well, and his stat line isn't impressive this year because he's commanding so much attention. And when you're putting two guys,
look, Carolina
on him,
fans have to know that's familiar, right? That's the Jadeveon Clowney playbook all over.
Exactly. He's allowing everybody else around him to feast while he's taking away all the attention. And look, he's still going to get his. He's going to have his breakout games, breakout moments, get sacks, and all those kind of things. But like you said, they haven't needed him to do that up to this point.
Yeah, for sure. All right, you got another one for me?
I do. This one's a little bit more general, but we saw it this past weekend with Ole Miss going on the road, losing at home to Kentucky as a top 10 team that nobody saw, coming, obviously. I don't think they're going to be the first top 10 team in the SEC to lose to an unranked opponent. There's been so much variety and parity, it seems like, in college football and the SEC this year, where I can't figure out a lot of these teams week to week. Like, man, we thought Vanderbilt was going to be something after winning that game against Virginia Tech, and they go and lose to Georgia State on the road a couple weeks later. And obviously, Ole Miss was beating lesser opponents pretty handily, but doing it in the way you expect them to do it. And then you lose to a team you had no business losing to in Kentucky, who, by the way, had just taken Georgia to the limit 2 weeks before. Like, there's going to be more big upsets in the SEC as the year goes along.
Yeah, I think that there is something that the SEC is benefiting from this year, which is the top of college football is pretty thin. And I don't want to take anything away from, what was it, a couple of weeks ago, 6 of the top 7 teams in the AP poll were all out of the SEC. I don't want to take anything away from any of them, but a big part of that is, look, Oregon is not what we thought they were going to be. Notre Dame is not what we thought they were going to be. Florida State certainly isn't what we thought they were going to be. So there is kind of a lack of power at the top of college football. Now, to your point that it won't be the last time we see an unranked team beat a top 10 team in this conference, I would tell you it's going to happen again this week. However, because of the come-from-behind nature of the win over Arkansas, Texas A&M finds themselves in the top 25. I mean, they are already a 2-point favorite, or at least they opened as a 2-point favorite against Missouri. That game is in Kyle Field. Sometimes the helmet is right and the record is 4-1 and you put them in the top 25, whether they're one of the 25 best teams in the country or not. But I think that A&M over Missouri would qualify as the same kind of upset.
I thought you were going to pick Vanderbilt to pull off the win against Alabama, because when you come into Nashville, they show you how to play SEC ball.
Listen, the last time those two teams played, they scared Alabama. The Tide only escaped with a 52-point win. You never know what could happen in that game. That
covered the spread, right?
That did. Well, I'm glad you brought up Vanderbilt, because they are the subject of my last one. They are the biggest game left on Carolina's schedule, because the loser of that game is not going to a bowl.
Yeah, and that's one, again, through the first month of the season, we went from first 2 weeks, man, that game's going to look tougher than we thought. Well, then they lose to Georgia State. Okay, maybe they're back to being Vanderbilt. Then they take Missouri to the limit and very well could have won that game. It's so hard to figure out this team. And again, we go into every single year, every fan base does in the SEC. Mm-hmm. Vanderbilt, that's a layup. There's your win. Go ahead and put that one on the board. But this year, maybe not the case. And again, they're the classic case of a team that week to week looks drastically different than the week before.
Yeah, Diego Pavia, their quarterback, is just a playmaker, man. And this is why I hesitate to say who I think is going to win that game. Because if you are a playmaker at quarterback, we assume that means with the legs, right? And I would think a team with the defensive front that Carolina has an advantage on stopping a quarterback like that over somebody that might be stronger in the secondary. But we've seen Pavia how many times this year, and going back to last year at New Mexico State, use those legs to buy him enough time to improvise a little pitch forward to his receiver. If they can bait Carolina into that, I don't think it's crazy to think Vanderbilt is going to win that game. But honestly, I can't tell you which one today I feel comfortable putting money on. I do feel comfortable saying that game is going to be the difference between 6-6 and 5-7 for somebody.
And I think there's something to be said, too, for a program like Vanderbilt that, again, is routinely the doormat of the SEC that, you know, is winning 2 to 3 games at best, usually against non-conference opponents. When they have a little bit of belief in them, when they've tasted success or come close to knocking off like a top 10 team, that goes a long way. Again, for these guys, say, hey, we know we can do it. And instead of just being at that'd be November at that point in time, saying, all right, our season's over, we're not going to a bowl. Let's just go through the motions and finish off this season.
For sure. I want to throw something at you that I saw being talked about yesterday on the various national TV morning shows as I was at the gym. Do you think coming out of that game on Saturday, do you think there is a legitimate conversation around Jalen Milroe being the number one, if not number one overall pick, at least the number one quarterback in the 2025 NFL draft?
I think that was a eye-opening performance for a lot of people that looked at Jalen Milroe last year, and he progressed as the season went along. But again, he got benched early on in the season because he didn't have a great performance against Texas, and he was limited in those middle-range throws. But that's something he's gotten drastically better at this year. Obviously, his athleticism speaks for itself. He was killing Georgia with those outside runs in the first half of that game. They got better when they put an extra linebacker out there and could kind of spy on him a little bit. But I think he probably shot up a lot of people's draft boards, and I think he's number one on the Heisman list as well as of right now with that performance on Saturday. But
I don't think the Heisman is even worth talking about at this point. Like, he's so far ahead of everybody else. I will give you Travis Hunter is right there with him, but we're relying on a far too big, far too old voter base to do something they have never done before in terms of considering a guy that's not in a championship conversation. That's why I kind of dismiss Travis Hunter, as unfair as that might be.
Yeah, and going back to Milroe when it comes to the NFL draft, you know, we've talked about Beck and we've talked about Ewers, and these guys kind of positioning themselves as the top, and there's no reason to think that Jalen Milroe shouldn't be in that same conversation now.
I think if you look at a team like, let's use the Panthers as an example, right? Bryce Young was not built to be the quarterback of that kind of team. If you think back to, was it the 2017 or 28? I believe it was a 2018 draft where Baker Mayfield was number one, right? And it was Mayfield, Sam Darnold, Josh Rosen, Josh Allen, and Lamar Jackson. Well, who are the three that have stuck around with consistent success? It's the guys that can move. And I do think that people look at Jalen Milroe and it's some sort of combination of Lamar Jackson because of the speed, and frankly, Cam Newton because of the size. Now, those guys are lightning in the bottle. I would not bet on it happening again, but I think when those are the comps, I'd feel better about that than a lot of the other quarterbacks in this draft.
When the draft rolls around this spring, we'll take a bet on which of those quarterbacks is going to be at the Wharton School of Business 5 years from now, like Josh Rosen is apparently.
Man, look, I'm not alone in this. I had that so wrong. I thought he was the home run of that group coming out.
Well, he was the Rosen one.
Right. That's true. I forgot about that. The man had a hot tub in his college dorm room. Go look that up.
I feel bad for him because they took an unnecessary shot at him on Sunday Night Football, and I can't imagine he was too thrilled about, you know, maybe casually watching that game and getting, you know, caught in a stray like that.
Man, to be the guy that will be the answer to the trivia question of like Cliff Kingsbury's actual like first roster move as head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. Like just a doomed position for a doomed experiment.
Well, we have a list of busts for a reason. He's certainly on there, right up there with Jamarcus Russell and Ryan Leaf. Dimitri, appreciate it as always, and we'll check back in with you next week as we roll through the month of October.
All right, buddy. Talk to you then.
Absolutely. It is the Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you. We'll dive into what the SEC and the Big Ten are trying to do for the future of the college football playoff. I'm not a fan. That's coming up next here on your Wednesday on the Game. Welcome back into the Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you here on your Wednesday on the game. Reminder, as Ole Miss comes to town this weekend, is your next chance to win the Loyola Special Teams Touchdown Contest. $500 up for grabs as the Gamecocks take on the Rebels. If they do score a special teams touchdown, you can win all that money. Just go online to 1075thegame.com and register for your chance to win Loyola Special Teams Touchdown Contest. If there is no touchdown this weekend, that money will roll over. $600 up for grabs as they head on the road to Tuscaloosa next weekend, taking on Alabama. So it is no secret that the SEC and the Big Ten are the two most powerful entities in college sports, not just college football, but that's where most of our focus, comes to. As a alumni of a SEC school and a, media person that covers an SEC institution every single day, I'm very proud to be a part of this great conference, to whatever degree you describe that as. And I'm sure many of you in the fan base feel proud that your institution, the team that you pull for, is a part of something that's so strong. Gives South Carolina, obviously, great financial support, and one that's not in danger of, ending up like the Pac-12 and crumbling into, ruins overnight like it did a year ago. That being said, too much power can be bad for the sport as a whole. Heather Dinich of ESPN reported that coming up next week in Nashville, the ADs as well as the commissioners of the Big Ten and the SEC are going to meet in Nashville about continuing to strengthen their bond and working together to change some things in college football. Now, this was back in the springtime, where the leaders came together and said, hey, we should work together instead of against each other to try and help ourselves out to a degree. And among things that are going to be discussed at this meeting next week is a scheduling agreement that could potentially lead the SEC to going to non-conference games, which we think is going to happen at some point, and having a lot more crossover between the SEC and the Big Ten, high-profile matchups in the regular season, those kind of things, which, hey, that's all fine and good, and I love that. I'd love to see Alabama and Ohio State, Georgia and Michigan play each other in September as opposed to watching Ohio State, beat up on Toledo every year or something like that. I think that'd be really cool to see those kind of matchups on a more consistent basis. Obviously, we do a lot for strength of schedule in the SEC. But they're also going to discuss the future of the college football playoff. Back in the springtime, the college football playoff and ESPN agreed to extend their contract through the 2031-2032 season with a deal worth $7.8 billion. Now, in order to make that deal happen, the other conferences and Notre Dame surrendered most of their power and leverage to the SEC and the Big Ten in terms of the formatting. Now, as of right now, the current structure of the brand new 12-team format is only in place for the next handful of years. 2026 is when things can begin to change. And that's where this meeting between the SEC and the Big Ten becomes interesting because, again, they hold a lot of power when it comes to the decision of what this format is going to be. And remember, they were initially pushing for AQs, more AQs in this initial 12-team playoff. They ended up settling on one AQ from the top four conference champions and then one AQ from a group of five representative as well, which, again, and I myself am not an AQ fan, but that's okay. If we're going to do AQs, that's fine with me, whatever. But what the SEC and the Big Ten are pushing for is 4 AQs apiece, whether that be in a 12 or a 14-team format, because we don't exactly know which way it's going to go. Very likely could end up being 14, just to add more games to it, which produces more revenue, more ratings, and all those kind of things. But that being said, let's say it is 8. Let's say it is 4 on each side. You're talking about the SEC and the Big Ten automatically having 8 of the possibly 14 teams in the college football playoff. No matter what, no matter how good or bad each league is that year, they would automatically be taking up half the field. Now, I know the thinking is, well, they're usually the best teams anyway, so what difference does it make? I get where you're coming from, but I think that continues to create this divide and shift in college football. I think it should have to be earned, right? Like, again, could the SEC get 5 teams in this year? Sure. And if they do, that's great. But that's because those teams are good enough to justify being in a 12-team playoff by being ranked in the top 11 or, having 10-win seasons or whatever it may be. I don't like the idea of just going into the season knowing, all right, if you finish top 4 in the SEC, you're going to be in. Finish top 4 in the Big Ten, you're going to be in. Because the seasons aren't always created equal. Yeah, number 4 in the Big Ten this year could be 10-2, or they could be 8-4. And I don't want to see an 8-4 team for the Big Ten get in just because, hey, they finished 4th in the Big Ten and these rules and AQs allow that to happen. If I had it my way, there would be no automatic qualifiers in the 12-team or 14-team or however many teams rolling in the playoff. It would just be straight up, take 1 through 12, rank them that way. You can give 1 through 4 byes, and then, 5 through 12 play in the first round. And again, that gets complicated, I understand, because then it's still subjective with, the committee and all that kind of stuff. But if we're going to do AQs, then I don't love the idea of the SEC and the Big Ten saying, we're just going to take half the spots for ourselves. And again, the ACC and the Big 12 and, the Group 5 conferences aren't going to love that, but they've yielded their power to the 2 main conferences to allow the format to get to where it has at this point. And again, the SEC and the Big Ten, I understand they're looking out for their own interest. They don't care what happens with the ACC. They don't care what happens with the Big 12. If they fell off into the ocean tomorrow, that wouldn't upset Greg Sankey or Tony Petitti because they're going to continue to print money in the SEC. So from a business standpoint, I understand you're going to do what you can to make sure your business is the most profitable, that your organization, in this sense, a conference, is going to have the best opportunity for success. Because that's what, the more teams you have in a playoff as a conference, the better shot you have at winning the national championship. And yes, is it most likely going to come down to an SEC and a Big Ten team more often than not? I'd say probably so. But you have to earn those spots. And this is one of those things where I don't like this direction of college football, where the SEC and the Big Ten just are creating their own riff, right? Because we've talked about, they're eventually going to get into this 2-team Super League. Personally, I don't want that. I want college football to remain some kind of structure to what we have now, where you have, your 4 power conferences now that the Pac-12 has, been regulated to being Group 5, but that everybody is still somewhat on equal footing. And if you do your job within your conference, you have a shot to make the playoff and compete for a national championship. I don't want this just to become an SEC and Big Ten show. Be great football, but there's got to be some kind of foundational structure of what college football still is existing. And I think if the SEC and the Big Ten get to this point of saying, we just automatically take up half of the playoff field, no matter what happens, how good or bad our teams are every single year, I think that continues to create that divide, which I think overall, from a fan and entertainment standpoint, will end up hurting the sport. But it's one of many things that continue to evolve in this new day and age of college football. We're getting new teams added to the Mountain West and the Pac-12, and things are shifting all around. Obviously, the money, the lawsuits, what's happening with NIL, there's so much going on. It is nice that when we get to Saturday, we can just focus on football, but this mess continues to unfold, in the days in between that, unfortunately. And this meeting next week in Nashville might go a long way, and again, further creating the riff in college football. It is Wednesday. We talk with Jen Jensen from the early game about NASCAR and what's going on with the NASCAR playoffs, which we'll do coming up next. It is The Extra Point. It's our head along with you on your Wednesday on The Game. Welcome back into the Extra Points Outhead along with you on your Wednesday here on The Game. Reminder, coming up on Friday, since it is a home game, have the Friday Tailgate Show out at Columbia Craft on Green Street down the Vista with Jay and Elijah from 3 until 6 p.m. And then at 7 p.m., the Love Chevrolet High School Football Scoreboard Show with Justin Hall and Elijah Campbell. Should be back to running until 11 this week after they had to change things around last week because so many of the games were getting canceled or postponed because of the weather, but should be back to normal coming up on Friday to take you all the way until 11 o'clock for all the action happening around the Midlands when it comes to high school football. Want to hit this text from Jeff from the Firehouse Subs text line, 803-404-6100. Going back to what I talked about earlier on the hour with the SEC and the Big Ten working together to potentially monopolize the college football playoff. I don't know if that's the right word for it, to where they get the majority of the spots in the field in either a 12 or 16 12 or 14 team format, because they do leverage a lot of the power when it comes to that decision-making process. Jeff says, this is another unintended consequence from NIL and unrestricted transfer portal, nonsensical conference realignment where you're seeing what made college football unique go away little at a time. I would prefer no AQs, top 16 teams go home games, higher seeds, no buys, no bowl locations, home field advantage for every game would be huge for the sport. I like your idea of the, just straight up there at the end of no AQs, home games for the higher seeds and be more of a kind of traditional playoff. The unfortunate part is there's so much money tied up in the bowl system, which is why even as the playoff continues to evolve, there's still a bowl presence in it, which I think is kind of ridiculous to make teams play 2 bowl games at neutral sites before eventually playing a national championship at another neutral site. You're just asking fans to travel a lot over the course of the month, especially if you play in your conference championship game too. I just think that's something that, is going to come back to hurt in time with, I think, lower bowl turnouts as far as, ticket sales and all those kind of things, just because you're asking fans to travel a lot. And I think that's something that I wish could be corrected, but won't because, again, so much money tied up in the bowls. But the beginning point that you have there is something interesting. And it's a unique conversation to have because the sport of college football from 6 years ago to now is a night and day difference. In 2018, I believe, was the first year they had the transfer portal, and we had no idea it was going to evolve into what it's become. And, if you went to a coma in 2014 and woke up to look at college football today with everything, NIL, the portal, all these kind of things, you wouldn't recognize a lot of it. That being said, when the games kick off on Saturdays, it's all the same. The game between the white lines has not changed, save for, change the clock rule and, certain penalties and things being, changed around and things like that. The game itself is still good. Great even. In fact, looking at the numbers from Georgia and Alabama on Saturday, they averaged 12 million viewers. It was the most watched regular season primetime game since 2017 when Alabama played Florida State. That was season opener that year, pulled in 12.3 million. The audience peaked at 14.1 million between 11:15 and 11:30, which was the final couple of minutes of that game where Georgia took the lead and then Ryan Williams, got the touchdown and took the lead back. So still huge numbers. And we'll obviously see the ratings for the college football playoff be astronomical. Like the sport from like a numbers and financial standpoint is still good. And I wonder what is the tipping point for college football? At what point do you actually start to drive people away? Because we've seen a lot of other sports change quite a bit. Again, I'm a big NASCAR fan. Me and Jen just talked about it in the last segment there. NASCAR has changed so much in the past 20 years that a good portion of the core fan base that was around 20 years ago has stopped watching and stopped caring. And the ratings are a fraction of what they once were. Revenue's still good because of TV contracts and all that kind of stuff, but the sport itself has hurt itself by making so many changes that people weren't pleased with. College football, you're a little more ingrained with it. College sports in general, because, it may be the school that you went to and stuff like that. So I think it's harder to drive an audience away. But every time we make these changes, it does make me raise my eyebrows a little bit like, okay, is this something that could push people away? And while the thought of the SEC and the Big Ten having 4 AQs, that's not going to hurt people locally, in SEC and Big Ten country. But if I'm the ACC, if I'm fans in the Big 12, yeah, you might get your automatic qualifier for a champion and maybe one at-large bid if you're lucky. But I would think you're probably throwing your hands up and saying, we don't even have a chance. Like, the cards are so stacked against you at that point, you may say, what's the point? And I know it's very hard to give up something you're passionate about in college football, but it seems like at some point that line's going to be crossed. What that line is, I don't know. What day that comes, I don't know either. But in a sport that continues to evolve and change as quickly and rapidly as it has, not all for bad reasons. Again, I'm a big proponent for players getting paid and all that kind of stuff. NIL is a little bit more of a mess than we thought it was going to be, but not everything is bad necessarily. But still, change is something that you are walking a fine line on when it comes to the long-term health of your sport from an interest standpoint. Because again, it all goes back to TV dollars. And if you run into a time where people stop watching your sport, well, guess what? You're not going to get as much revenue from ESPN and the likes because of less interest. And again, I don't know where that line is, but things like this could slowly start to push people away. And we'll see if it ends up happening if the SEC and the Big Ten do decide to ultimately do that. That'll do it for today's edition of The Extra Point. Coming up next is the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs. Get back into the Ole Miss discussion ahead of Saturday's game, 3:30, which kickoff. Pre-game coverage starting with myself and Elijah Campbell at 10:30 for Gamecocks Game Day, all right here on The Game. 11 o'clock on your Wednesday morning. Welcome in. It is the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs. Tyler Head, Wes Mitchell, and Chris Clark along with you. A lot to get into over the course of this hour. We'll jump into previewing Ole Miss, got some recruiting stuff to talk about. Also, look back on a former Ole Miss South Carolina game that was pretty significant in the history of this program. But we'll want to kind of start off, and we'll get into some of the stuff that Beamer said here in a couple minutes. But looking at this team, specifically Jackson Dart, and when you look at the caliber of quarterbacks that South Carolina has played so far this year, obviously Garrett Nussmeier was a very good, solid quarterback that had a good day against South Carolina, but Jackson Dart is a step up in competition for the most part. Very more experienced, played a lot more football than Nussmeier has up to this point. Obviously has a lot of weapons like Nussmeier did a couple weeks ago, and is definitely going to be a challenge to contain on Saturday.
Yeah, I think you look at this offense too, man, and just the tempo they play. It is so what I call momentum based in terms of just that first down of a drive for them is so key. And I thought Kentucky really, like you talk about getting a team off schedule, and that's a key every week. I think it really is. But for teams that are just built on this fast pace at times offense and being able to just build that momentum, and then, hey, once we get a first down, if we're Ole Miss in this scenario, we kind of have a pretty good idea, especially early in a game, of what we want to do next. And, so they do a very good job of just, all right, we got that first down. Let's get on the line. We have a good feel of what we're doing while you as a defense are trying to adjust in real time. And so I think that's the thing they do incredibly well. You look at Lane Kiffin, you look at Charlie Weiss Jr., who runs their offense and has been highly praised by Kiffin for what he's done so far. They're already thinking, a play or two ahead. So I think that's a big part of it. I'll be curious to see in some of those third down moments, can Dart make some of the throws that Nussmeier made? Because I think that's the thing that stands out about him is, like, this dude Nussmeier is a gunslinger. So you're going to get a few of those plays a game where you're just like, what was he doing? But also, I saw come across Twitter, I saw a video from this past week where, there's virtually no window when Nussmeier releases the football and he just throws the guy open into like a zone window, I think. And so, I think as with every game, you say, can you put pressure on the other guy? And then I feel like every quarterback has a certain threshold of pressure they can sort of still deal with to an extent. I was really impressed with how Nussmeier, as that game went on, like, hey, I'm getting hit, and it was almost like he accepted. I'm just gonna have to anticipate getting hit, and I'm gonna make some throws from some odd angles and in some tight windows. For Kentucky, Dart is fantastic. I actually had Dart. I don't think I ever articulated this, but I had him coming into the year just looking at that offense, both from a skill standpoint around him, what they try to do, and his ability, and the fact he can run a little bit. I had him in my mind like, man, this dude may win the Heisman. Mm-hmm. And have they come – is it one game, or have they come back down to earth just a little bit on offense? I think is a big question. But, Beamer, you can check off all the things. He talked about them yesterday in terms of, like, stopping one of these offenses. A big part of it, tackling in space. And so that, to me, isn't necessarily about the quarterback. That's more about, hey, he's going to get the ball out probably pretty quick at times to these receivers, let them go to work. If you're Carolina, you got to keep these gains at what they are as opposed to, bigger gains.
Where do y'all think Nussmeier and Dart, let's do both, where do they rank in the SEC in terms of the quarterback pecking order? I have some thoughts. I want to get yours.
They're probably right around top 5, fringe top 5, if nothing else, because you got, Milroe, Beck, Ewers. Those are kind of definitively your top 3, I'd say, in most people's minds. I'd say probably those guys are some combination of 4th or 5th, at worst, maybe 6th.
Yeah, I think on any given day, those guys are right up there. And I think it's really hard to when you start comparing, like, Milroe and, I mean, he is such an elite runner.
Yeah, like comparing him and Nussmeier is not exactly
it's kind of
apples to apples.
Like, I'm kind of glad in recruiting we went away from, like, dual threat versus pocket passer. Like, I'm kind of glad we went away from that, but you can sort of see why that was a thing. Like, it's, I mean, if you just said, hey, sit back and you can't use your legs at all, you know, Nussmeier is probably going to be able to sit there and throw the ball in tighter windows than Milroe. But when you add in the element of, hey, this guy can turn one little false step into a 50-yard gain, then everybody's all out of whack trying to stop that. And he says, well, hey, actually, I can get outside the pocket and flick the ball down the field 50 yards too. It becomes very difficult, I think. But, yeah, I mean, I think on any given day, you know, when that Ole Miss offense is ticking, Dart is as good as any of them. I think on any given day, Nussmeier is as good as any of them. Obviously, when you're talking about who's the best, you're talking about who can do it in an extended period of time. Who can do it the most consistently, I think, is probably how you actually determine the best. But, I mean, Carson Beck looked like the best or second best in the second half last week. He looked like the 16th quarterback in the first half. So it's kind of a lot of it depends, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking over some of the QBR ratings for the SEC from ESPN, and Jalen Milroe is their highest-rated guy right now. It goes Milroe, Dart, right now actually Arch Manning, since he's been playing more as of late.
Got a controversy in Austin.
And then Nussmeier and Beck. Lenore Sellers actually 14th on this metric. So that shows you, like, Sellers has played pretty well overall as a freshman. And he's down here towards the bottom of QBR. But, man, if you dive into Nussmeier, so LSU's played better competition than Ole Miss so far overall, right? Like, they have a common opponent with South Carolina and both playing Kentucky. Other than that, you know, Ole Miss hasn't played really anybody, while LSU has played, you know, they played a South Alabama team that had been playing pretty well. They had to go play Southern Cal. They lost that game. They played better competition overall. But some of Nussmeier, like these deep dive analytics, even though he's fourth on this list, are extremely impressive. Like, they have one expected points added on pass attempts, 37.4. Like, he's higher than Dart. Like, he's the highest in the league in some of these metrics. And I think almost even more impressive because he's not as much of a runner. You know, like, he will stand in there. He can throw from different arm angles. So, you know, it's not like South Carolina, to bring it forward and give a point to all this. It's not like South Carolina is seeing a really good quarterback for the first time this week. They've seen one. Like, Garrett Nussmeier is really, really good. And frankly, doesn't have, at least in that game, does not have the weapons that Dart has either. And he's out there making things happen. Now, he's got a better offensive line, but he was still making throws with guy, you know, Kyle Kennard all in his face. So it'll be another test. It'll be a different type of test, but it won't be anything that the Gamecocks are just completely flabbergasted by seeing a good quarterback.
And Jackson Dart can make throws at all levels. Now, his completions down the field, when you go past 20 yards, it's right around 50%, but 9 of his 13 touchdowns have been on those deeper balls. And a lot of those are going to Trey Harris, who, again, is accounting for about 40% of the receptions of that receiving corps so far this year. So you're going to have to account for that passing game at all levels, which is going to be a big key for this defense on Saturday.
I got something I'm curious about that some people just may not care about. Like, it gets a little bit deeper into the weeds, but I'm curious. So we know there's a bye week. Carolina's coming off a bye. They generally have made not wholesale changes, but they have made at times some fairly deep adjustments in the bye week, both offensively and at times defensively. I'll be curious to see, do we see any changes in the secondary going up against a Ole Miss sort of spread you out, great receivers. Yeah, they have one just stud, but all their guys can get open. All their guys can catch the football. Do we see something maybe in terms of like sliding a Kilgore back to safety and putting a more corner-type guy at nickel? This is something we've seen South Carolina do at times in the past. Chris and I have talked about it even coming into this season. Like, do you have some packages that put Vakari on the field with a Judge and an OD Fortune? If you were going to break something like that out, this would be the week to do it, I feel like. That doesn't mean it has to even be your base defense. But if I had that in my back pocket, this would probably be the week to bust it out, because just from a personnel standpoint, this would be the team to do it against. When you look at like some teams, yeah, they have 3 wide receivers. Just about everybody uses that personnel now, 11 personnel. But Ole Miss probably has as balance. It seems weird saying they have that much balance when Trey Harris has been by far their best receiver, but they really do have balance in that room.
I'm intrigued. So you got, in your hypothetical scenario, you have Nicky and Kilgore at safety in a coverage package, and then you're bringing Swain on as like a third corner for that nickel spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could I know, I feel like DQ gets a bad rep from some fans when he's had a couple of moments where that are glaring, but he's played pretty well, in my opinion, overall. I mean, I think there's a lot you can do. Like, if you wanted to go full on like dime defense, you could have all those guys on the field at the same time and really really lean into athletes being on the field, basically. But, Carolina, they like those linebackers so much. I feel like they don't love the idea of taking them off the field, but I think that's something, at least if you can get them in those 3rd and longs, I think that would be a viable thing to look into.
We'll get into what Coach Beamer had to say yesterday in his weekly presser. Looking ahead to Ole Miss this upcoming weekend, it is the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs here on the game.
All right, I want to tell you about our friends over at Integrated Media. Michael and Nathan and their entire crew have been to my home, they've been to Wes's home, and they can come out to yours as well and make sure that you are outfitted with the very best audio-visual technology. Whether you need something as simple as just, hey, I need a TV mounted, but I don't know what the best kind of TV is in 2024. Maybe I know how to mount it, but I don't really have time to mess with it. I've tried before. I've messed it up. They can do it for you. And even if you say, hey, I've got this fireplace, I think it'd be really cool to mount a TV on it, but can you even do that? Yes, they can. They mount TVs on all sorts of surfaces as long as it's safe. They can make it look good. They can give you the very best equipment. You don't have to go to the big box stores. Get great local service from Integrated Media. But if you want a complete smart home system where you can control your lights, thermostats, devices when you're away from home, they can do that for you too. IntegratedMediaInc.com or 803-948-8327.
Welcome back in. It is the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs, Sour Head West Mitchell, and Chris Clark along with you on this Wednesday. Reminder, tomorrow, we're going to be out at Gold Line Framing in West Columbia from 9 until noon. Taking over once again, getting you set for South Carolina and Ole Miss coming up on Saturday. Then tomorrow night, NFL Week number 5 getting kicked off with Thursday Night Football, Falcons and Buccaneers, which you can listen to with pregame coverage starting at 7:30 right here on the game. Yesterday, Coach Beamer spoke to the media for his usual Tuesday press conference, looking ahead to Ole Miss this weekend. And one of the things that he was asked about is how the offense is coming along and if it's starting to figure itself out now that we are a month into the season. Cut number 6 here, Dave. Here is what Coach Beamer had to say.
Yeah, I think so. I think every week that's a process, and there's no question we're better at running the ball. There's no question that each week we have to be creative in how we run the ball. There's no question that we've got athletic quarterbacks, so continue to accentuate those positives. You see our receiving core; those guys continue to step up and make plays. So I think it's understanding our personnel even better. Really realizing how we're going to win football games around here without a doubt. And then you mentioned the self-scout. That was critical last week after 4 games to really be able to step back and say, what tendencies do we have, whether it be personnel-wise, formation-wise, that we really need to attack and combat. So, yeah, I think every week you continue to get better. And that'll be the whole key for us, not just on offense, but defense and special teams, that we just continue to get better every single week.
And as we've talked about so much this season already, it's a work in progress when it comes to the offense. You have a new quarterback, you got a lot of new transfers in at multiple spots. You're trying to, improve as the weeks go by, and we've seen steps forward. And last week, Kentucky showed you don't have to go out there and put up 500 yards of offense to beat an Ole Miss team. If you play sound enough defense, do enough on offense, you can win. So Carolina doesn't have to go in there having to be the most explosive offense in the world to win this game. That being said, we want to see more steps being taken forward, because as you go through this tougher second half of your schedule, your offense is going to need to be dynamic to beat some of these teams that you have left.
Yeah, and I think the thing about Kentucky is they're able to stay on the field. So I think in modern offense, like modern football, we think of scoring is a successful offensive drive. And, you have to score for it to be something you applaud. But I think Kentucky really had an old school approach to this game, and it was keep Ole Miss in front on defense. And, there's that old football adage that you want every drive to end in a kick. And so that basically essentially means just don't turn the football over, whether it's a punt, a field goal, or a PAT. Don't end a drive by handing the football to someone else. And so I think for Kentucky, the offense has been ugly at times this year. We saw that against South Carolina, but they showed, I thought, remarkable improvement. And then, here's the thing. Even at the end of the day, when Kentucky to me, watching the whole game, it kind of felt like, all right, Kentucky's doing everything they can to hang around, but you're going, are they going to be able to make a dynamic play to actually go win the game? And to their credit, on the 4th and 7, out of nowhere, They hit the big play down the field, and that was the difference maker in the game. So it's one thing to hang around. It's another to go make a play to win the game. So I think you're not going to beat Ole Miss. I would, in general, say you're not going to beat Ole Miss kicking field goals. Now, early on, Kentucky sort of took that thought and said, well, maybe you can. You can at least hang around if you're playing great defense kicking field goals. For the most part, you're not beating Ole Miss kicking field goals very often, I'll say. And you're darn sure not beating Ole Miss if you're going 3 and out. So I think the big thing is, Chris, you got the box right there. Do you have their third down conversions compared to Ole Miss? I know Ole Miss was 1 for 10. I don't think Kentucky was great on third down necessarily. But
4 for 16. So the teams are 5 for 26 combined.
See, yeah, that's ugly.
5 for 5 on fourth downs, though. Between the two.
Lots of fourth down conversions. But you have to at least be flipping some field position. If you take over at the 25 and you make a couple first downs and you punt and you pin them deep, nobody in the stands is cheering that outcome. But is that a very different outcome than 3 and out and giving it right back to them in good field position or great field position for them? I would argue yes. And so I think the offense has continued to improve. I'll be curious to see, hey, what's Dow Loggins' plan this week? I think for all the negativity about Dow Loggins to start the season, he's had some pretty good game plans the last few weeks. And so I think we need to give credit for that. He's got 2 weeks going into this one. Really, could you have looked ahead a little bit Akron week if you wanted? Probably. So I'll be curious to see what the plan is.
Yeah, now, we talked about in the Kentucky game a couple different points here. Kentucky game, I thought the offensive staff had some really good looks against Kentucky's defense. Remember, Beamer pointed out, hey, Kentucky's defense is structured differently than a lot of teams you're going to play. I think he said that leading up to the Gamecocks playing Kentucky, and he said it yesterday when he was talking about Ole Miss's struggles against Kentucky's defense. You can't copy and paste. You can't just just do whatever they did. Kentucky's defense is structured differently than South Carolina's. You can't go in and just completely overhaul this thing. But Dow Loggins, how does he attack Ole Miss? Wes, I imagine more man coverage, I think, than you would see from Kentucky, probably, who's more of a zone-heavy team, like a physical zone.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what Ole Miss's defensive structure is, but I would almost blindly say anybody plays less zone than Kentucky. It feels like. But I'll say this. Ole Miss, man, they are handsy in the secondary. Like, they've really struggled at corner to an extent. And I think they got that one kid that's pretty good. The other side and at safety, they've had their share of struggles. I think, it's been a little bit quiet among the fan base not having Jared Brown last week or 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And what is his status going into this game? Can you keep coming along at that wide receiver position? I think that's a big thing if you want to talk about this offensive progress. Can you keep coming along? Can you force them to have to interfere with you again like they have in some previous games?
And that is a big key. And Ole Miss as a whole is the 125th most penalized team in college football. And a lot of those penalties do come on the defense. Looking past this past weekend against Kentucky, 5 penalties on defense, 2 pass interference, and 1 holding. And again, that's something that is consistent through every game they've played this year. And when you're a team like that kind of builds that reputation of being very handsy, being very physical when it comes to receivers in the coverage game, you're almost going to lose the benefit of the doubt with officiating crews when it comes to, okay, if that was close, then they're probably going to end up calling it. So that's an area that Carolina could potentially exploit this weekend, force them into making those kind of things where they are giving you free yards, giving you first downs, and taking advantage of that.
Yeah, you can best believe the officials will have their eyes on that. And obviously, I think, officiating, how does this group of officials choose to call this game? Like, we've all been watching games where maybe they allow both defenses to get a little bit physical when the ball's in the air, and they sort of take they're both hand fighting, there's contact from both guys. They kind of take that approach. Or we've all watched games where they call it to a T, and they don't allow those things. So I think that'll be something to keep an eye on there as well. And, if you're Carolina, I think you have to adjust on both sides. Like, if they're going to let Ole Miss play physical, I think on defense for Carolina, you got to say, all right, we're going to try to take advantage of that a little bit and be a little bit more physical with these guys, because we do know there's one thing about Carolina's defensive backfield. Torian Gray recruits size, he recruits length. And so if they let you play a little bit physical as an officiating crew, then that could maybe even play in Carolina's favor as well.
I want to pivot away from previewing Ole Miss for a minute because we do have a lot of things happening on the recruiting front we need to dive into coming up next. It is the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs on your Wednesday on the Game.
All right, our friends over at Firehouse Subs can not only take care of your lunch and dinner cravings, but they can also take care of your tailgating needs. So if you're going out to the game this weekend, if you're trying to plan out your tailgates for the rest of this season, home or away, consider our friends at Firehouse Subs. They've got their catering platters that you can order from at firehousesubs.com, or my favorite method, the Firehouse Subs app. Of course, if you're hungry for lunch or dinner while you're listening, go check out 14 and growing Midland's Firehouse Subs locations. You can use the Rapid Rescue to go to order online or through the app. Avoid the wait. Your food will be hot and ready when you get to the store. Again, 14 different locations all around the Midlands. Check out, for a limited time only, the new Firehouse Captain's Club, which is sauced and spiced to perfection. It features the Captain Sorensen's hot sauce and the new Firehouse Hero sauce, which is actually awesome as well. Or your Firehouse Subs favorites, firehousesubs.com.
Welcome back in. Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs. Tyler West and Chris along with you on this Wednesday. Of course, Carolina and Ole Miss coming up on Saturday, 3:30 kick, pregame coverage, starting with myself and Elijah Campbell for Gamecocks Game Day, sponsored by LexMed Orthopedics, Saturday at 10:30 from the party lot out at Sound and Images, leading you up into network coverage. I want to jump into some stuff going on with recruiting because quite a bit has transpired in the past day or so, and we'll lead off with a guy who, a while back, I think a lot of people were surprised, decided to not commit to South Carolina, that being Malik Clark, the four-star wide receiver out of Rock Hill. Well, now he has decommitted from Florida State and opened his recruitment back up.
Chris, I was thinking about this last night. Are we on the, Mazio Bennett track here if we're Malik Clark?
Yes.
I mean,
the temporary, detour.
Yeah, like you for much of the process. I don't know if for much of the process you felt good about Malik, maybe like you did Mazio. But North Carolina, I remember, was actually very strong with Malik early on. Then South Carolina made their push, and leading into the announcement, we were feeling pretty good about where Carolina was, and you started to hear a little bit of Florida State, and you're wondering, hey, what's going on here? He commits there, and two thoughts here. One, I think we are seeing the fruits of Carolina having a pretty good start on the field. This is something we talked about in general. If they're going to have the recruiting class they want, if they're going to have the start to the 2026 class they want, they're going to have to erase some of the memories of that 5 and 7 and, frankly, remove some of the ammo that opponents have against them and saying, hey, this is a team that went 5 and 7. You want to not go bowling? Go there. And so a lot of chatter we were hearing was, hey, they just need to get off to a good start, and the recruiting is going to tick up again. And so that talk has actually materialized, in my opinion. And, I mean, guys, I feel like they all of a sudden have some momentum again on the recruiting trail, both with 2025s plus with 2026s, maybe even with 2026s turned 2025s. And, I think – back to Malik, though, this is a classic follow the visits, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Florida State having an awful year. They go from, hey, we should have been in the playoff to just dumpster fire. What's the
getting dog walked by SMU this past weekend?
Oh, that was bad. I saw the tweet and forgot to click on, or just didn't click on it at the time. Forgot to go back. They played a sad version of the SMU or the FSU fight song. The SMU band did.
Oh,
after they scored, I think their 40-something point. Brock Glenn era starting up there.
Yeah, did he start the ACC championship game for them?
I think he did. Yeah, and
can't get worse, can it?
But Clemson,
can always get worse.
How many breaks? I don't know. Clemson fans would tell you that they would catch a break if DJU was the quarterback. But really, their last two games, two of their toughest games this year were supposed to be NC State and FSU before the season.
Yep.
NC State, they got to play without their starting quarterback. FSU stinks, and also a backup quarterback. So, anyway, that's
a terrible schedule.
It's awful. Anyway, I digress. I'm taking us way off track here. It is interesting how quickly the perception turns. And like Shane Beamer talked about this, I think at Birdie's with Beamer, the golf tournament, he said, look, perception is reality. And if we're going to change the perception, we just got to go win some games, and that'll take care of itself. Recruiting, any of the talk out there. And it has, Wes, pretty quickly, in 4 games and, just in a month or so, you kind of go into the season saying, man, they missed on some targets. What is their status with some of these 2026 priorities? Can they flip anybody in 2025? Fast forward a month, and now look at where they are, So it just goes to show you can't get too up or down about one game at the beginning of the season, win or loss, and you can't get too up or down based on where recruiting is with several months still to go. We all knew if they could come out, win some games, show some progress in the early part of the season, you had an opportunity to flip around the perception, but I mean, really the reality of where you're at in recruiting, and that is you're in a much better spot than you were a month ago.
Well, I think if you look at just the reality of recruits is that they do not watch games the way fans do. And now, would you love to be sitting 4-0 and top 25 and just the roof about to blow off this thing? Of course. But when you're a recruit and you watch South Carolina go toe-to-toe against LSU, you watch the atmosphere. You're looking, game day is there. There's a flyover. It's one of the best noon atmospheres I've ever been at. You're sitting there going, man, this program is on the rise. And so I think that goes a long way with a lot of these guys. Now, what would go further would be, because they got another big list of guys coming in this weekend. What would go even further would be, can you push it over the top and beat Ole Miss and be able to say, hey, we're 4-1 with a controversial loss, tight loss to LSU. And that, to me, takes a good bit of the pressure off of that Alabama game. Because, I mean, not that the guys in the building are going to feel this way, but if you're objectively you're looking at it, that's going to be a tough game to win. But it takes some pressure off this little stretch that they have. I know people have sort of pointed to it as like this 4-game stretch. I look at it as a 3-game stretch. Ole Miss, Bama, Oklahoma. I've said I think Oklahoma is beatable. And I know we're talking recruiting, but just the general perception of your program and what's going on is obviously affected by the wins and losses in a general sense. So losing one game does not usually cost you a prospect. But overall,
losing lots of games.
Yes, it very much does. Yeah. And so I think they're sitting there. I know some fans don't care about this, but you start to look ahead at that 2026 class. So those are your current juniors in the state of South Carolina. I start to look ahead. I'm like, man, feel like they're in pretty good shape with that guy. Pretty good shape with that guy. And it's that's a strong class. And we know how this state sort of, the way Charles Power says it, prospects bubble up at different moments in the process, sometimes a good bit later. So the 2026 class in the state of South Carolina, Palmetto State, is already very strong and pretty deep. And that's before the just under-the-radar, diamond-in-the-rough type prospects have started to show themselves. You know, Josh Smith right down the road, 2025, perfect example of a guy who's come onto the radar later in the process and now is a priority guy for South Carolina. There will inevitably, because there are every year, be guys for the 2026 class that fit that very bill. So I think you got a great opportunity if you're Shane Beamer, if you're that staff, to continue to build the foundation of this program with these two classes.
Speaking of the 2025 class, opportunity to bring in somebody for this class that maybe you weren't expecting to. With that coming up next is the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs on your Wednesday on the Game.
All right, guys, let me tell you about our friends over at Gold Line Framing. We're going to be there on Thursday. That's tomorrow, right? Tomorrow, Gold Line Framing. Come see us, 511 12th Street, and you can come in there and check out all their wonderful things in store: art gallery, home decor, furniture, and gift items. Also, any and all of your custom framing needs, they want to handle it. Diplomas, original artwork, canvases, jerseys, flags, and really even beyond that. Like they've got some stuff in the back that I didn't even know was physically possible to frame up that they have still been able to frame up for some of their wonderful customers. Call them today if you want to go ahead and set something up. 803-739-1337, or just come on by and see us. We'll be there 9 a.m. to noon on Thursday. Come by and see us. Hang out with Tyler, hang out with Chris, hang out with me, and also go ahead and set something up for a custom framing job. 803-739-1337.
Welcome back in. Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs, Towerhead, West Mitchell. Hey, Chris Clark along with you here on your Wednesday on the game. Again, reminder, tomorrow we're going to be out at Gold Line Framing in West Columbia from 9 until noon. You can come by and see us. We'll get you set for South Carolina and Ole Miss coming up on Saturday. But continuing on with things going on in the recruiting world, some pretty significant news coming out yesterday as well. Donovan Murph, the 4-star wide receiver out of Irmo that seems like South Carolina might be in the lead with his recruitment, has now reclassified from 2026 to 2025.
Yeah, I think, guys, this is a trend I think we're going to start seeing more of because, one, you have Ryan Williams, so obviously is able to do what he does as an early entry, and it's just become a national story at this point. People are like, wow, this guy's incredible. If he can do it, I can do it. And so I think we're going to see that trend sort of take off. Obviously, in today's college football landscape, as much as NIL is a factor in things, if you're in high school, and even if you're in a state where you can make money off your NIL, you're going to sit there and say, man, if I'm physically ready, I can go ahead and be making a lot more money in college than I can in high school. So I think we're going to see this trend start. You know, I've seen Murph in 7-on-7 settings. I know Chris has seen him in game settings. And, I mean, he's a big physical athlete. Like, I think he physically can make the jump. The recruiting process is interesting there. It feels like, to me, Chris, early on, and this wasn't even necessarily stuff, I mean, I won't speak for you. It wasn't stuff I was hearing. It was more just stuff I'd seen online. It felt like there was some Clemson talk early on. You know, recently, and again, this is more online chatter. Recently, there's been some Alabama talk, and of course, you know, he was at the game this past week. Any prospect that went to that game is going to be buzzing a little bit, I feel like, about what they saw and that opportunity. But it just feels to me like South Carolina has kind of just quietly gone about their business and made him a priority, chipped away at this thing, and done a really good job building relationships here. I know you went by the school and interviewed him a week or two ago. He's very complimentary of the staff, very complimentary of Mike Furry, the wide receivers coach. And I know he told On3 he wants to take his official visits now. Now that he's moved up, he can do that. And I kind of feel like South Carolina has just quietly put themselves in a decent spot going into these visits.
Yeah, I do think Clemson has been a legitimate factor with him. You know, I don't know if rare is the right word. It doesn't happen as much as you would think, I guess is the right way to put it, where you've got a guy in the state of South Carolina that ends up being a primarily Clemson-South Carolina battle. That doesn't happen as much as you would think. Those two schools, even though they're rivals, they don't go head-to-head on a whole bunch of prospects. And even within the state of South Carolina, a smaller state, yes, produces a good bit of talent. That doesn't happen, but it does appear to be happening here, although Bama and some others, as you said, Wes, have been in the mix too. It is interesting, this trend, and it's probably going to remain a small percentage, but, you know, the big trend in college football starting several years ago was more guys enrolling early. You know, remember like the 2009 class when you've got Stephon Gilmore enrolling early, then that was like a little bit eye-opening. Like, oh, man, like 2009, they had a good many kids enroll early. Now, if the majority of your class doesn't enroll early, it almost is a little bit odd. You know, go back and look at last year's class for the Gamecocks. Most of them enrolled in January, and so now it's just continuing to get pushed back, you know, accelerating the development of these young players. You know, Ryan Williams from Bama, you know, he graduates a year early. Murph's doing it. I do think there will be others in college football that continue down this path. But, yeah, Murph talked really highly about Mike Furry. You know, they have really, really prioritized him. Clemson really wants him. Carolina really wants him. You know, the thing that stood out to me about Murph, a couple things. You know, he went to Clemson for their last noon game, NC State game, then was back in, obviously lives in Columbia, in Irmo, but went to Carolina for the Akron game, took his grandmother. That was his grandma's first ever college football game. You could tell that was kind of special to him. His whole family was there. He's very comfortable. Mentioned to me that Mike Furrey's like a second father figure to him. Even has a good relationship with, Furrey's son, Stone. They train together. Mike Furrey's wife. Like, it's a real family feel there. And so this is a prospect that, I still, with him reclassifying, that'll shift the rankings around a little bit, but he'll still be a highly ranked 4-star guy right here in the Midlands, the type of guy that you want to add to your class. And I think they're going to have a good shot to ultimately do it.
How does that change your approach when it comes to recruiting him now instead of having over a year to pull him into your class? You have, assuming he would want to commit for early signing day, right at 2 months from now.
Yeah, I think for the most part, your overall approach is the same. Now, obviously, it speeds up just in terms of, hey, let's go ahead and get him set for an official visit. Let's try to close this thing out. I think for the most part, you're going through the same process in terms of building that relationship. But is there maybe a sped up process just in terms of let's make sure we've said everything we can possibly say? I would say yes. And, I do want to address something like a rumor I've seen online. It's been people have said, hey, he's reclassifying to go to Alabama. We can't definitively say where he is going to go. Time will tell that, but I feel pretty comfortable saying he didn't reclass in order to go to Bama. I think he reclassed, and just as he said, he's going to consider some schools. I think the 3 we talked about, it seems like, are the 3 main ones, and we'll see where this process goes. But I think if you're Carolina, it's just about, all right, the scheduling changes a little bit, but you've already built that relationship. So it really does not change a ton. I feel like if this was a guy who was a late arrival on the recruiting radar, it might be one thing, but he's already been on campus a bunch.
Early signing day right at 2 months away. We'll keep an eye on it as that continues to progress. That'll do it for today's edition of the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs. Remember, tomorrow from 9 until noon out at Gold Line Frame in West Columbia. Come by and see us on your Thursday. Coming up next, halftime show with myself, Terry Ford, here on The Game.